So I moved to library and then got PhD. So just a minor detail of the accomplishment.
Minor, fairly important at the moment. Detail.
Yes.
Awesome.
Sean,
Hello.
By reputation.
Oh, hi. I'm making sure that hang on. It's going okay.
Yeah, so she's already, she said she bought that. Is it up?
Looks like it's a.
Is it broadcasting?
Yeah, it's broadcast. Oh. It's live.
They're all here. And my oldest is
I'm not sure if you want more. Right now, mostly on your presentation.
probably mostly where I will be.
I didn't want to pull it back too much because now I'm in the space of something.
It's kind of in front of the speaker though.
Yeah. They're really
You don't have to really be there, it's just gonna happen. It wasn't anything detailed or anything. It's not as long Some of that happens to us. So I'm gonna
I'm going to go ahead and get things started here. Today, Julie Medero will be doing her PhD tests. Julie got her bachelor's in computer science and linguistics at Fordham, and worked for a little bit for the investigative consortium, and then came here, got her master's in for Julie coming here, and then has been doing her PhD in simplification. The committee members are Linda Shapiro from UCS and Susan from Microsoft, who has been a supervisor and so we also, I should just point out, in case anybody doesn't know, Julie has set things up to do people hang out, so there may be people actually out there listening. Can they talk to us? So if you have any, I don't know if that works. I've never done it. So maybe. So I think there's at least a chat. Okay, so there may or may not be questions from the ether. So the way that I would like to proceed is Julie will do a 15-minute talk, and during that time, you are encouraged to ask questions of clarification. But if there's any extended questioning, I'll probably cut you off so that we can give you a good time to finish. Then we'll have an open question session, and then we'll take everybody out.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you all for coming out on gorgeous Seattle summer day. I think that this is Seattle's way of making sure that I don't feel too bad about having missed out on summer day. That's my kind of this. Not everybody else Seattle can do it. I'm going to talk today about the work I've been doing on characterizing text difficulty. And motivation for this comes from the fact that there is text everywhere. We're exposed to text all over the place. So if my kid gets sick and I want to find out more about it, I can go to Wikipedia, I can go to WebMD, I can go online and find articles and read that and learn more about health conditions. We have textbooks that we use in school and outside school to learn about new topics. Forms that people may fill out to get government assistance or get government programs. Social media. At this point, a lot of us interact with family and friends who are going all over the country or all over the world by logging on and sharing messages in text. Of course, you have newspapers where you can get information about what's going on around the world. And the problem with it is that none of that information is accessible to the 15% of adults in this country who are functionally illiterate. I mean, they don't read at a level that would enable them to carry out these day-to-day tasks that a lot of us take for granted because they have this barrier from their reading ability. And that can happen for a lot of reasons. So some of those are people with learning disabilities that are limiting their access to written text. Some of those are immigrants who may be very literate in another language but aren't literate in English, and so they have trouble accessing text in the language a lot of it is in the U.S. And some of those are just people who fell through the cracks for one reason or another. They grew up here, they speak English, they went to school for at least some time, but they don't have the literacy level they need. Have access to some of this information that learning has. And so the big goal of my research, what I'm really interested in being able to do is find a way to take all of that information and make the content of it accessible to people who might not otherwise be accessible to. And one way you could imagine that working somewhere down the line is having something like a browser plugin that you can use for web browsing. You can fill up on your desktop computer, and you load the web page. If it's too difficult, you can just on the fly change the difficulty of it, and you'll adjust it to the point where you can get the information you want. And you could balance how much it changes the meaning with how much easier it makes it to make change the meaning just enough to make it easy enough that you can use it. People who have a computer at home can have that installed on their own computer and have access to it. You can also have it in libraries libraries and community centers in other places that there are common computers that have access to help them get access to some of the information that we have. And to be able to do that, there are sort of three big challenges we need to address. We need to have a way of knowing when things are hard. So how do we figure out with the text what the hard things are in it? We need a way to then predict on new text where the difficulties are going to be used. We ran a news article that came out today to figure out where somebody's likely to have difficulty with it. And then we'd like to be able to automatically simplify that text to take care of places that we predict are going to be difficult. And I'm going to talk today about some of the contributions I have in my thesis that are making steps toward those big goals. So I'm going to talk about a corpus of parallel simplifications that we developed. We had multiple people simplify the same article sentence by sentence, and that gives us a way to understand how people simplify, how consistently different people will simplify the same thing, and just in general how difficult that task is for people to do. I'm going to talk about a new way of thinking about what it means for things to be difficult, or we'll use oral recordings of people reading out loud, and some case practice to look at information we can get from empirical measures during reading while people read sort of that loud. Then I'll look a little bit at a comparison of how those acoustic features and those case features match up. So if we get the same information from the oral information that we get from the case, there's something different about those. Those nice ties the previous work from the case, those case features back to what we know about cognitive load and difficulties, so we know the prior acoustic features. And then I want to finish up talking today about some of the work we've done on identifying features of texts that are related to difficulty, to let us predict difficulty in new texts. We started out talking about this corpus of parallel simplifications that we developed. And the intuition here when we started this was that we could get multiple people to simplify the same things, and we have several examples of how to simplify the same sentence, and that would give us multiple good gold standard answers for how this sentence should be simplified, and we could learn and evaluate off of those multiple simplifications. That's something we see in other NLP tasks, and we see translation and summarization. That's a common way to deal with some of the issues in evaluation. And it would also let us look at how well people can simplify sentences, not trying to do it automatically. How well can you do this manually? So we set up a study. We took guidelines from Simple English Wikipedia, which is set up inside of the Wikipedia project as into another language. So you can look at an article in Wikipedia, you can look at it in English, you can look at it in French, you can look at it in German, or you can look at it in Simple English. And that says that it's supposed to be written so that it's accessible to a second language learner or a low literacy adult or a child. They have guidelines for their editors and how they should do that, so we took their guidelines to see how well multiple people can follow those guidelines.
Yeah, so the Simple English Wikipedia allows humans actually taking a more complex article and then write.
Those are all human done. So it's just like if you go in and say, I'm going to write this article on tarantulas in French, you can go and say, I'm going to enter an article on tarantulas in Simple English. And you could do that by taking the English one and then simplifying it. You could do it by starting from scratch. You could just take the first paragraph of the English one and then make changes to that, and you see all of those different approaches that people will use. We have 6 articles. 2 of them came from CNN broadcasts, 2 were Wikipedia articles, and 2 came from Encyclopedia Britannica. That gives a total of 155 sentences. We recruited editors. They were all grad students from the HCD department who had a technical writing background, and asked them to simplify these articles. We let them see the whole article, but they simplified one sentence at a time, and that gave us sentence alignment. So we knew which sentence was supposed to be a simplification of which sentence, but they had access to all of them, and they were allowed to enter multiple sentences as a simplification of a single sentence, or enter no sentences, or to leave it exactly whatever they thought would make the best or resulting article in that 2 identification. This is an example of the kind of thing we got. So it was an article about WTO protests, streets, the images were just as ugly. One of our indicators decided that that sentence was fine the way it was, didn't make any changes to it. 5 of them came up with new single sentence simplifications that made slight changes to the sentence. The last editor came up with this 4-sentence simplification. So their simplification is the violent protests and anarchists were a problem. The police need to take control of the streets. Police need to stop violence, and the anarchists, people did not like the way police rode over in the streets. So I'm going to go ahead and just say that that one was really long. And say that, that's at least one of the possible problems we're going to in the Wikipedia article is that there's a chance that at least some of the articles we're coming up in Wikipedia were written by editors, and maybe they're clearer and more accessible, and maybe they're not. Because different people interpret those instructions so differently. But looking at the 5 editors who did make changes to the sentence, we see that several of them agreed that there's took back the streets was something that they wanted to do something with, and so what did they do? Use gain control, do a fight for gain control. E left it at took back the streets. F changed it from protesters, and C, the my perspective seems to have pretty much just taken that information out, so that there's not a direct correlate of that information in their simplification. Similarly, with images were just as ugly, you see that E changed it to a lot of violence still happens. They're taken with images were just as ugly. That's a fairly abstract way of saying that there was a lot of violence in the street, and a more concrete and clear description of exactly what was happening. C also used violence and said that the police were also violent. E and F both, instead of as ugly, changed it to just as bad, like the situation in the C versus the image. And so these are some of the changes that we see. We looked at when trying to predict whether people would make those sentences longer when they simplified them because they felt like things needed to be explained more, whether they make them shorter because they thought things needed to be taken out, or whether they do something maybe not quite as extreme as what G did, but splitting the sentence into more than one sentence. We can split into 2 versus 5.
The interesting thing with the exception that was that nobody actually took it from passive to active.
No, they didn't. And I think that's actually something that was in the Wikipedia guidelines for writing voice for voice, things like passive voice. So that's an interesting observation that none of them.
The only one, I mean, like D made it active, but removed the qualifier,
Right.
You know.
And took out any mention of the violence or the ugliness of it, just said what the police tried to do, but didn't lost the description of what the scene was like. And so overall on these, when we looked at whether people would split a sentence into multiple simplifications or whether they would make it longer or they would shorten it, we found fairly low agreement across the editors. More than half of the sentences were made longer by at least 2 people and made shorter by at least 2 other people. So they very much didn't agree on what to do with them. Very few people left the sentences alone. They almost always made some changes. And it's not clear whether that was because they really thought every sentence needed to be changed or because they felt like as part of this task that they were being asked to do, it was their obligation to make the sentence as they could. But we got a lot of changes.
With your interface, was it possible for them to compress 2 sentences into one? Because you said for each sentence they were given input.
Yes.
So how did anybody express the desire to compress 2 sentences?
We had at least one person ask about compressing 2 sentences into one, and the way they were told to do that was to put all of it into the first sentence and leave the second one as an omit entirely. That didn't happen very often. They did have permission to do that, but we also saw that a lot of the simplifications weren't direct flexible simplifications. So if you look at which words were most often removed during simplification, you get a long list of function words. You get a and of and the, and words that were artifacts of other changes, be it syntactic changes or kinds of things that we looked at on the last page. A lot of those had to do with rephrasing at a higher level. The fact that those words show up as the most frequent Removals, not probably surprising to anyone who's done a lot of work on topic modeling. Those are the most common words that show up when you just look for frequent words and documents, and that's where things like the IDF models come from. But that motivates some of the work we do later on and how we're going to define what it means to work. Difficult looking at how often, based on how often it's removed from articles. And overall, this showed us that there was a huge variability in how people did the simplification. It was a fairly difficult task, even for people to do. And so we started asking how else we could figure out what it meant for things to be difficult. And that motivates, the next thing I talk about is our approach of using oral readings and empirical measures of people reading to try to get at what it means to be difficult. So what we really want is to be able to take an article like our diabetes article, when we have LCD one measure, we want to be able to take that and predict where it's going to be hard. And we don't have a way to do that right now. And so what we're proposing is to use audio features from people reading out loud as a way to get at that difficulty. At this point, we don't know how to do that either. That's part of what the research is about. So what we're going to take advantage of is the fact that there's previous work in psycholinguistics and reading studies showing that there are features you can get from gaze tracking that are related to difficulties. And so we're going to see how well we can connect our audio features to those gaze features that are related to difficulties. And if we do that, then we'll have evidence that the audio features are related to difficulties. So this thesis is going to look at the connection between the audio and the gaze features and how those relate to difficulty. Start out by talking about what those audio and gaze features look like. So the audio features that we can use to characterize difficulty. We took advantage of some data from the Coding Predictions for National Assessment of Adult Literacy. This study from the Department of Education back in 2003. The goal of that study was to characterize the literacy levels of U.S. adults. So they went into homes, they went into prisons, they sampled the population and had people read stories and word lists and other literacy tasks to try and understand how well people could do. And for the work I'm doing here, we had access at UW to phone-aligned transcripts of automatic transcripts of those readings, but we didn't have access to the audio itself. So we have, at the letter sound level, what they said and how long each letter lasted, but we don't have the audio. And we're going to leverage the fact that oral assessment is a fairly common thing to do when you're trying to assess people. So if you go into a classroom, you're very likely going to find them measuring how well students read by having them sit down with standardized passages and read out loud and see how many words they can correctly over the course of a minute. And that tells you what reading level they read at. And the big difference between that and what we want to do is that we're not interested in assessing people, we're interested in assessing the texts themselves. Another big difference is that we want to know exactly where people are having trouble. So we do these assessments of people, we're looking at an average rating across the home, standardized story of how quickly somebody can read fast and able to read. But you're not looking at the exact locations that they make mistakes. If we want to get those specific locations, we're going to look at where errors occur, but we're also going to look at other cues that people have difficulty with. Those errors can be fairly sparse. So we're going to look at where people hesitate. We're going to look at where they have longer pauses than you might otherwise expect. And we're going to look at where they have linking, so where they draw out some or all of the sounds in the word, showing that they have some uncertainty. I'm going to show you examples of what each of those look like when people are reading. This is an example of somebody making a straight substitute together.
In the old days, builders commonly discussed wood to make it look like other kinds of building material.
So in the story they're reading is builders from guys wood. And this reader read it as discussed, but then just kept going. So it was straight, it was an error, and they just kept going. You also see people that hesitate with classification, any full pauses or restarts on a word.
For his test, the researcher used his wife's food recipe that includes onions, sweet potatoes, par- 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 parsnip, turnip, carrot, celery, stem, parsley, seasoning, and of course chicken.
And so this reader hesitates. She eventually reads parsnips, turnips, and parsley all correctly. So if you're doing just error counts, or just doing words correct minute, she would get credit for having read that word correctly. But she hesitates at it and stumbles over a little bit. We also look at pauses, and in this we have to account for the fact that there are communicative reasons that people will pause at the end of future phrases and at the end of sentences. So we built a model that predicts where those should occur, and then in places that people pause where you wouldn't expect them to pause based on the structure of the sentence. And we find examples.
We have always been able to share escapades and humor with our friends.
So that pause before escapade isn't motivated by the structure of the sentence or anything that would give us better understanding of the reader's intent. It's just a pause while she figures out what the next word is that she's supposed to be reading. And the final acoustic cue that I want to talk about is maintenance. This is when we draw out some of the letters.
The door to her office is always open and the students are encouraged to talk to her about any problems they might be having.
Again, it's an example where you're not going to get an error. You're not going to have anything coming up from just the words that she said that would show that there was any problem at all. So you have that, and it's completely accurately. But the time that it took to read and encourage gives us a clue that that was something that was difficult for her, that she was struggling with. So if we could take advantage of where all four of those cues happen, we could have more examples of places that people struggle with. So I'm going to set those aside for a minute now and talk about the gate features that we're going to find audio features too. Because again, we have previous work showing that the gate features are related to difficulty and cognitive ability. When you're reading, it can seem like when you read your eyes, you move smoothly across the screen, and when you actually look at where your eyes are on the screen, it turns out that you make a series of fixations and jumps between discrete points on the screen. So you can look at those fixations, and you can also look at regressions where you're reading along and then your eyes bounce back to the previous spot and then move along the screen again. We're using eye tracking to measure reading. We have somebody sit down at the computer screen, we have them read out loud, and then we can track where on the screen they're looking as they read. We can map that point on the screen to the word that they're looking at during their reading. This is what our eye tracking setup looks like. We have this eye tracker that sits underneath the monitor and bounces the infrared light off of the pupils of the reader, and then has a camera that can check the angle that that light comes back. And based on the angle, we can figure out the coordinates for the usual and then the backwards coordinates for the word they're looking at. And once we have each of their fixations back words, then we can look at the fixation time, so how long he's been looking at each word, and also the probability of a regression. So how likely is it that somebody gets to the word escapades and then goes back to reading something previously. To be able to connect our audio features to eye tracking, we ran a new eye tracking study. So we used the passages that we had all this audio for from the fan study and did a smaller study where we had audio and gaze tracking for a line. 72 participants. They're on average just under 31 years old. 59% of them learned to speak in English first, and 72% of them learned to read and write in English first. So we had a fair number of people who learned to speak another language, but by the time they were learning to read and write, they're going to school in English. They moved to the U.S. very young, for example. Learn another language as preschoolers, but we learned to read and write. And we had each of them read 10,000 words out loud. So 8 of those were the text that we have all the audio for from the fan study, and 2 of those were brand new texts that were written for our study. And this is a
Guide on seeing every dog led very interesting life. For at least 10 or 12 years, they are responsible for living a field with her To do this job, they must be intelligent, gentle, and very well trained.
So if our reader is reading along, those red dots show where she is looking, the size of the dot shows how long she is looking at that spot. And the following read, they notice that she didn't fixate on every single word. So you skip over words and you can process more than one word at a time while they're reading. But in general, this is the data that we get out of that eye tracking and the audio data. So given that we have that audio data and we have that gaze data, now we want to look at how we can compare those. And what we'd really like to do is make this connection between audio features back to difficulty, and we can get at that by showing that our audio features tell us something about the gaze features that we know are really close. So we're going to align our gaze for audio and see what's happening. This is a plot of what happens when one of our readers from the same story about seeing eye dogs. A dog loves nothing more than to be with its master, and guide dogs keep their master company all the time. This plot time is on the x-axis, so as we go across that's time in seconds. The y-axis is showing word index in the article, and the red is showing the person's gaze, and the green is showing the word that they're reading. So at a high level here, we can see that with some variation, those track each other fairly well. We can gaze map each other.
So what that index is actually the number of the word.
The number of words. So the first word is
that's what word index.
right from the whole article.
And then red was the eye gaze and green was the audio.
Yes, that is the eye gaze, green is the audio. So we can see from the top, zoom out of the whole sentence that those match fairly well. What I want to do is zoom in here and look a little bit at what's happening at just with its master and. This is one of those places where the color on the projector is not showing. Those are the color on my screen, but not up here. So it's with its master and. So let's, there. So let's look at this. So now we have the green is the person reading, so we have horizontal lines for with its master and. You can see that the line for master is longer than the line for the it, which is not surprising because it's a shorter word than master. You can also see a diagonal line between master and that shows us a pause between the two words. So that's a spot where there is a break between the end of master and the start of and, where no word is being spoken. On the right, you can see a long fixation at with, then a short fixation on master, back to with, and then up to and. And so the nice thing here is that we see this regression in the gaze where it goes back after it's mastered that matches up very nicely with where the pause happens in the audio. So this at least suggests that we have something going on that we can match up to the eye tracking and the audio, and that there might be something there. Looking at that a little more formally, we're going to look at pausing interpretations and lengthening in the audio, and we're going to look at fixation duration and regression frequency in the gaze and see if we can make connections between those. And we found that pausing was associated with a difference in fixation duration, so when there is a pause, people fixate on average 72 milliseconds longer than when there isn't a pause. Hesitations were associated with longer fixations and with more frequent regression. Yes.
That example brings up that there's punctuation that causes pauses and hesitations that might not have difficulty unless you're assuming it and comments and places.
Yes. Yeah. So people and is making the point that punctuation can introduce pauses that we want to happen. And that's absolutely true. So on both the lengthening and the pauses, you have those happen at breaks for good reasons. So you have ends of brief phrases, you have ends of sentences, you have places that you expect somebody, if they're reading fluently, to have pauses. And for this analysis, we build a model that predicts all of those and then throw out all of those locations. So we're only looking at locations that we would not expect there to be a pause.
so I'm wondering what the significance of the format is, sort of in terms of, is that like the word that comes with it?
That is part of what we've been trying to figure out is what is it, what kind of difficulty does that signal? Is there a difficulty with the word? Some of the previous work has shown that people will regress when they get to a word that either is difficult or that is surprising for some reason. Also, you get to a word that doesn't match the syntactic structure that you expected, or that doesn't match semantically with what you thought was coming. You'll go back and reread as a second guessing yourself to see if you got that stuff before. I got that.
Discussed and should disguise. That's the kind of practice.
At some point, they might have gotten to the point where they realized that's really didn't make any sense there, and go back look at it. But it could also be in our to read very slowly, we fixate on one word at a time. We'll see it at places where they maybe predicted that there was going to be the end of a sentence or the pause break, and then there's time. And the sentence keeps going. And so they predicted a boundary there, and there's not a boundary, and then we go that big, the earliest it's supposed to stop her at. But something is different in this other thing.
Was there any causing?
I didn't find any evidence of that, but it's possible that there's some of the readers. That was part of what would cause them to have hesitation. I didn't find anything consistent with that.
The other thing I was wondering on the previous slide, but there's, it just struck that one. Yeah, if you go to that, it's almost like the steps are more based on syllabus. With its master as 2.
Right. And so when we look at lengthening, we're looking at the phone level, so at the individual level, we have to deal with the fact that some words are longer. We also have to deal with the fact that some people just speak more quickly than other people, and that some letter sounds are just longer than others. So some phones are longer on average than others are. You can build a model of what those look like, and it turns out that the way that model works out, adjusting for different people is a matter of applying linear scaling. So you take everything you have from that person, you figure out what their reading is, you normalize for which phones they are, how many there are, and who is speaking, and then we look for durations that are surprising once we've kind of thought of that. Because yes, otherwise what we get are longer words take longer. And that's part of the problem with just doing how many words can you correctly in a minute, instead of you have a lot of long words in there. There are only so many words you can get out of your mouth in a minute versus if all the words are short. So we want to make sure that we compare that. But with the project fixations, increase the likelihood of long fixations, and they also increase the likelihood of a regression. So if people hesitate, they're also likely to regress. And we found that lengthening is also associated with longer fixations and with an increased likelihood of regression. And so this gives us some evidence that the cues we're pulling out of the audio just need to be related to the cues of the case data that we know. Given that, I want to spend the rest of the time I have talking about the work we've been doing on trying to actually predict where new things are going to be difficult. That's what we like to do at the end.
So the main piece out of that was that being able to connect the audio and the gaze.
That's right. So now we have connected our audio to our gaze. Now we want to look at if we have a new text, can we predict from the audio, or can we predict what the audio would look like, where we think we're going to find this difficulty in the audio on something brand new. And we're going to look at two different kinds of difficulty. We're going to look at difficulty with individual words, and we're going to look at difficulty at the sentence level. So for words, we're going to look at word lists that were also part of the span collections, in addition to people reading stories out loud. They had to read lists of words that were isolated in columns. And that's nice for trying to get at lexical difficulty, because now we don't have the syntactic structure. We don't have punctuation. We don't have to worry about any of that. They're just reading individual words that don't have context. We took 3 word lists that people read in that study. We threw out the first word on each list, we put 3 pause, and it's hard to measure preceding pause when you don't know when they first got that word, which is when you started reading. And that really left us with 120 words. The first list starts off very easy with words like up and it, and the list gets gradually more difficult so that the last word can get sensible. And we're going to build a model to try and predict how difficult these words are. We have the linear regression model and full cross validation. And our target for each of those is going to be a rank value that we assign to each word that tells something about how difficult it is from all of those acoustic cues. We're going to take all of our errors and hesitations and our pauses, and we're going to be trying to sort all of our words by how difficult they are, and then pick that. And the way we're going to do that ranking is to take each of our acoustic cues, rank the words, and so then you have 4 scores for each word. So the word it maybe was 5th on the list for number of errors, and 10th on the list for number of hesitations, and 7th on the list for lengthening. And we're going to take all of those scores and we're just going to average them. We looked at taking the minimum, we looked at taking the mean, the domestic mean, and the median. Found that of these 3 word lists that we had, they all sorted the lists in effectively the same order, and the mean gave us lower variance. So we used the mean for all of our results here. We're going to start off with a model, a baseline that just uses the length of the word and the mean frequency of the word. So how long is the word and how common is it? And those are features that are used in a lot of the traditional difficulty measures. Then we're going to look at one at a time, adding in different features of words that might tell us something about it. So we'll look at from dictionary, the number of parts of speech, the number of translations, and the number of senses of the word in which you're entry. And the previous work showing that very common words tend to have a lot of translations entered in Wikipedia or dictionary. They tend to have multiple senses compared to very technical specific terms that have 1 or 2 very clear defined meanings. And so words that have lots of translations, lots of senses, and lots of parts of speech can be easier words. We're also going to include a frequency difference, which is the log frequency difference from the simple standard English Wikipedias. So this was trying to get at the fact that if you just look at how often words are removed, you get a list of function words. But if you look at how many documents a word is in the standard English, and you look at how many of the equivalent simple English articles it's in, and we do a log difference of those, that really gets us at thinking about how often the word is taken out. Well, normalizing for how common it is in the first place. And then we also use a score from a character language model, 7-gram model that gets at how likely the sequence of letters in the word is. And for people who are just trying to figure out how to decode the word on the page, that tells us something about how surprising that sequence of letters is, or how phonetic it is, how easy it is to pronounce just from what you see. And for each of those, we look at the rank correlation with the rankings that we got from the acoustic values. Just baseline, we get a rank correlation of 0.61. Adding in each of those individual features, we get a slight improvement, so there's only 120 words on our list, and those are significantly reduced small sample size. We did take the part speech count and the character and gram likelihood for the 2 that is best, and added both of those to a model. And that gave us another slight boost in that result that was significantly time. Looking at sentence difficulty, we're going to do something very similar. We're going to go back to the passages, so the full stories that people read in that fan study. We have 97 sentences that they read. And again, we're going to do linear regression with controlled cross-validation, and we're going to rank the sentences from the acoustic cues, just like we did for the words. So we're going to look at the averages of errors, and the averages of hesitations, and the pause rate, and the average word lengthening for all of the words where we don't expect that lengthening for the pauses to happen, given the structure of the sentence. And those features here, we took all the features that we used on the word experiments and binned those. So we would have features like how many words in a sentence had less than 7 translations. We have features all the word features that look like that. We also had features that we extracted from automatic syntactic parsers, so we looked at the number of sentence nodes, the number of noun phrases, the depth of the parse tree, is something about how complex the structure is, and also the parse probability, which again tells you about how complex the structure of the sentence is. And then we added topic features. We built a topic model off of all of English Wikipedia, 100 topics that are built to represent all of the topics in Wikipedia. And the way that model works, we can then give it a sentence or a story and get back a 100-dimensional vector that represents how likely that sentence or story was to come from each of those topics. And if you have that vector for 2 sentences or for a sentence and a story, you can then look at how similar they are. We can cosine similarity between those vectors. So we look at how similar each sentence is to the document that it came from. And we also look at topic entropy. So we look at whether that vector that you come back with is one where all of the mass is on 1 or 2 topics, so 1 or 2 of our 100 topics seem to capture it very well, or whether it's just distributed across all of the topics and none of them capture it very well. So starting with the baseline of just the lexical features, so looking at just word difficulty, we get a rank correlation for the sentences of 0.58. Then we add our topic and our syntactic features, topic vector features, and herding the syntactic features give us a significant boost over the baseline. So putting this all together, now we have, what we really have to do is be able to come in and take a new document and ask it where we think things are going to be difficult. So I put these models that were trained for predicting difficult words or difficult sentences, and through them at that article, we gave our annotators, at the beginning we talked about the WTO protests to see what it would come up with. And it predicted that the hardest words would be environmentalists, seemingly preliminary, residential, temporarily, surrounding coalitions, politicians, and anarchists. I also asked it which sentences it expected to be most difficult that didn't contain the 20 most difficult words in the document. And so that's some of those sentences that we thought were structurally difficult and really didn't have one of these very hard words. And the hardest sentence we came up with was Thursday events were delayed for hours due to the blockade and security care in the convention center, which is a fairly long, complex sentence. Now, to be able to evaluate how good these predictions are in these new documents that we really have to do is go and collect new readings of people reading these stories out loud and see if we can predict practically where they're going to have to take and where they're going to have make errors and use that for how we use this model to build up within onion texts. Going back to this big picture where we want to be able to know where things are hard, predict where things are difficult, and then simplify things automatically. I talked today about how we can know where things are hard using features from people reading out loud, and I talked about how we can predict difficulties. I'm going to talk just for a minute about how I think we could put those into a system that might be able to simplify automatically as future work. So you can take a sentence and build a graph where we have nodes and events between them that are all the words in the sentence. We might decide that we think escapades is likely to be a difficult word. And so with a paraphrase generation system, we can ask for synonyms, so we can come up with papers or adventures as possible alternatives for escapades at just a few lexical level. We can do the same thing across more than one word. So maybe raised by a family, we have a paraphrase generation system that comes up like a family raises them, or just raised is just the 2 words brought up. And we have something like our topic model that can tell us how much we're changing meaning, how close together is the original phrase and the new phrase. And we have our prediction of difficulty, we can look at how much we build a score for each of those edges that says that combines the expected change in meaning with the expected improvement in difficulty, and then look for after that to give us the best version of the sentence for a given other feature work I'm interested in related to this, we're looking at how genre affects difficulty. So are the same things that are predicted in a news article of difficulty going to be useful when we're looking at a high school math problem, or when we're looking at health documents, or other different groups that are useful. Similarly, we can look at how difficult have different features that affect those people. So are the same features that are good for predicting difficulty for low literacy adults also useful for second language learners just with different weights on them, or are they totally different features? And finally, there are some enhancements we can make from the model. We looked at accounting for prosodic boundaries, but we didn't look at prosodic emphasis. And so there are ways to pause or lengthen for emphasis reasons that weren't captured by our parsing model that we introduced in those models. With the new data that we collected, we also have access to the audio. And so in the new data collections that we did, looking at different genres or looking at different populations, we have access to the audio. And then you can look at things like pitch and energy in the audio recording. So you have people who will get very quiet when they're uncertain about what they're saying. And so the volume will drop off when they're reading something that they think might be wrong. Or the intonation will rise because they'll say the word like they're asking a question. I'm not really sure if they're right. And so those are things with access to the audio that we could add in that might give us additional clues where people are having difficulty. But as a summary here, I talked about the new corpus of human simplifications that we collected, where we had most people simplify the same sentences. We looked at how and where they agreed we would that was a difficult task for them. Talked about how we could use oral readings to characterize text difficulty and connected back to case features that we know from this work are related to cognitive load. And then I talked about how we can use features of text to predict difficulty. These are the three conference papers that have come out of this work. And I'm not going to name everybody, but I've had a chance to work with a lot of great researchers in my time here, and I've had great peer mentors and mentors and people who just picked up the slack on other things when I was just very good work, so I want to thank them.
So we're open for questions from anybody?
Question about, I don't know if that's ways of recruiting. Curious, where are you, I know we talked a little bit about your recruiting challenge, and I was just wondering about, sorry about that. How did you end up, what was a good, what was a good way to be able to recruit? It looked like a lot of them were ESL. Just curious if you kind of went for that or if that was kind of.
That's a great question. So that's about how I did the recruiting for the study. I recruited from several places. Big Person came from a nonprofit that I volunteered at, a literacy source, where I taught a citizenship class at the DSL and also taught an introductory math class. And that was helpful because it meant that I had students there who knew me, and so I could go in the classes when I was recruiting, and there was even one of my former students in the room. They would say, hi, Julie, how are you? I want to sign up, and then 5 other people would sign up too. So that worked much better than walking into a classroom where I didn't know anybody who participate in a study, but because it was a huge thing to ask of a lot of them. That's one of the great advantages of being able to get at this difficulty from this audio is that through the gaze tracking, people can come here and sit down in the lab at the university and get calibrated to this equipment. And a lot of my students are the people who take me through that to get to school in the first place. We're working through the job, so I get called from them. My second job called me this morning and they have an extra shift I can pick up, so I can't make it. To be able to do this with audio, and I can go to literacy course, sit down with my laptop and catch students at the 5:15 classes, reading the stories out loud for me. As we're creating through the community colleges, like the couple of GED prep classes at community colleges there, and some of them are there.
And then the other question I had was, to what extent, like the data, especially negative data in the audio, has anybody else done any, I'm sure this was in your general exam, but I'm just curious if that was, to what extent there was other work done that work you guys.
I'm not aware of a lot of work that has done this, particularly for the groups, for the populations that were there. looking at doing reading tutors for children using audio, and there are people doing very careful gaze tracking studies to understand cognitive load, the connection between the two is real.
And so the graph you had that you showed us with the word endless and so on, that was something that just came out of your brain, right? Wasn't something that had been done before.
That's not a standard way of visualizing things. That's right. But a good standard check for what we were doing.
Yeah.
Listing that interesting little bit WTO article, a lot of your interviewers, consistent with the goal of increasing comprehension and change idioms and expression get disappearing. And I was wondering if when they're made up of really easy words, does that show up in your days and acoustic features that these are probably not as difficult phrases that you can change, or do readers plow through them and not do things because the words themselves are easy?
I think that's a great question. It's one I don't have a definite answer to. My sense is that those are going to be a lot of the ones where people get through the words and then realize it didn't make sense. And then you might see a sign of difficulty, that like what we see in difficult structures, that you get to a point where you realize that they're not sure what's going on. But I don't know that I would pull those out specifically to look at them. And those are things that we may be able to get from looking at language models, how predictable are these words likely to come together, or these words only follow each other in this phrase because it's really in that expression. It's not complicated.
So you just said you thought your features were rich enough to take your data. In the data you collected, are there many idioms?
I don't think there are very many in the data. Those stories were written at 4th and 8th grade level, so certainly the 4th grade ones are pretty concrete and explicit about what they mean. And there's much less, even at the 8th grade level of stories, I don't think there is very much of that in our audio. But it would be really fun to see what happens if you did those. I know there are gaze tracking studies looking specifically at those kinds of phenomena and really following having people do the same sentence with or without that kind of phenomena. But I don't know if we can do that.
Just for clarification, did you take the original WTO articles and you run your study like at the very end?
No, I didn't. So this is how we could use it on something brand new. Because we don't have the evaluation.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to take that again now that you have this audio and then go back to what you discovered about people wanting to change the sentence structure.
Right. Yeah, it would be. And I don't have that answer.
Correlates to it. The other question was when you were doing it, I believe you said you used quotes from HCE.
Yes.
Did you think about using special ed teachers or any other population to do the editing?
For the study, I didn't. I know that Mari's been involved in studies where they worked with teachers in the past on doing, that was on judging reading level.
But we do have, it was studying. There's a huge amount of variation.
So they had huge variation even on, given a story, is this what age level is or what grade level is this appropriate for? There was huge variation on that. So we didn't do it. My guess is that we would still get pretty big variation.
Good question. Quick follow-up. I think it's slide 33 when this is the sorting stuff. I was curious when you chose these, to what degree these were original from your sort of to what degree this sorting, is anybody else doing this sorting and you just adapted it?
This ranking is not based on anything other. So this was a new way of finding things, and we're still talking about how we might do that and how we might want to change it. Okay. Now that it was a first step, and there are some things that fall in it, and some things that we might want to get better results if we can put a little bit.
Not so the tool may be better or a way of analyzing it to add researchers.
I think eventually it would be great to have something where we can say that we have two versions of a story, you collect audio on it, this is how you can write them, evaluate them, and say concretely that one is actually simpler than the other. So if you have an automatic simplification system, collect and spend information and say something about how well you actually simplify it.
Great, thanks. Okay, last chance. All right, we'll thank Julie again. We'll kick non-committee members out. Anything else to put on the list?
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. You can take that.
Were there any questions on the Google Hangouts?
No, there.